And hello again, everybody. This is Chris, MTGO's Rex Dart, and I'm back with another episode in my ongoing deck tech series looking at the Tribal Legacy Wars format in the Tribal Apocalypse Play Run event. And this is the Halloween special. And I thought, what could be more appropriate for the Halloween special than, at long last, hitting some of the mono black decks that have been popular in the event over the years. And Mono Black is an archetype which has been much beloved by the players over the years in all formats, and of course it seems like every time Standard format rotates, everyone's like, is Mono Black back? Is Mono Black back? It's one of those things that has a strange popularity, and although this deck I'm showing here was not the first Mono Black deck ever to be played, I myself played one in the 90s. Cards like Hymn to Turok, the Ice Age Pump Knights have always made a heavy commitment to black, rewarding. But this was one of the more famous, and it sort of spawned the current love affair with mono black control over the last 10 years. And this is from 2002. This one came in second place, piloted by Jens Thorsen in Pro Tour Osaka. This is Odyssey Block Constructed, and it took advantage of the fact that the middle set in Odyssey Block Constructed was heavily loaded with black cards, and that it sort of originated the whole Swamps Matter sort of mechanic, if you will, on cards that we see, such as Mutilate and Mind Sludge. And the deck was also given a lot of the sort of classic black things to do. Black is extremely good historically at killing creatures, and also at one point at killing lands. And black has the most tutors, and it has a discard theme. Black also known for the shade ability, and this is one of the more competitive shades that was ever printed. A 2/1 for 2 in black was certainly aggressively costed with a 1 black to pump back at the time. I don't know that other than giving it some form of evasion, this was probably the more competitive shade that was ever printed. And this deck was extremely successful, capturing multiple slots in the top 8 during Block Constructed Pro Tour, and I thought I would lead off with it here just to sort of show you one of the early examples. And before we get into the actual Tribal Legacy Wars decks, I do want to highlight these two creatures which were used in the deck, Nantuko Shade and Shambling Swarm. Always curious when classic power creatures from older formats, whether they can make the jump into Legacy Tribal Wars. Nantuko Shade has two creature types, Insect and Shade. Shade is kind of a problem archetype problem tribe in that all the creatures are competing with each other for your mana to pump them. I'm not really sure if that sort of deck would work or not. Insect just hasn't seemed to be looking for this kind of effect, but always something to keep on the lookout for if you're playing a more controlling insect deck with access to big black mana through something like Cabal Coffers. And I honestly can't tell you what that deck would look like, but it'd be interesting to see Nantuko Shade show up there, but that's probably the only place that he could. Shambling Swarm, on the other hand, horror decks have not been overly popular, and when they have been, they've tended to be graveyard combo decks, Manaless Dredge, that sort of thing. But Shambling Swarm here would be quite nice in a sort of horror control deck. Anything with a death trigger has a little bit of a problem in a format where Swords to Plowshares is extremely popular, but you can certainly see with the 3/3 body and the death trigger being able to distribute some counters that only last until the end of turn, albeit, but it might be quite good against certain swarm aggro decks, so something to keep on the lookout if you're building a horror deck, any more controlling heavy black vein rather than the combo version. But let's go ahead and jump into the Tribal Apocalypse Player Run event decks, and we're going to start with a Spirits deck played by AJ Impey. This finished just outside the top 4, came in 5th place in Tribal Apocalypse 43, which was the Halloween event from last year, and I really liked this deck. He's using, with this Spirits deck, Bloodghast and Restless Apparitions, which at first glance just sort of give him something to do in the early turns. However, since they both have come back from the dead abilities. They work really well with surviving the opponent's board sweepers or even your own board sweepers with something like Mutilate here, which he is playing. Tendrils of Corruption, another Swamps Matter card. This is the 4-mana version of Corrupt, but it will not go to the face. It can only target a creature, but you are in a format where everyone's playing 20 creatures, so that's not that bad a deal. He's also got some more additional spot removal here to soften up the opponent early, try to survive into the late game, where his control finishers are actually quite fantastic here. Most of them, again, other than these guys down here, his big guys all have some form of evasion, which is definitely something you want in a control finisher. He has Kokusho, who is very difficult for the opponent to deal with in any way other than an exiling effect. It's hard to deal profitably with Kokusho. Gastlord of Fugue with his unblockability, and Demigod of Revenge with flying and haste. All of these requiring a pretty heavy black commitment, but he is mono black and can definitely take advantage of that. The Demigod, of course, much like the Bloodghast and the Restless Apparition, also has the chance at some point in the game to return to the battlefield and wreak further havoc. Now, at the top end here, something else to do with all this mana would be some sort of X spell to finish off your opponent, which he's got here with Consume Spirit, which is sort of an updated Drain Life, and Profane Command, which, given the fact that his control finishers have some form of evasion, probably the last ability is not quite as useful, but the other three you can all see being very useful if you have large amounts of mana. So excellent looking mono black control spirits list here that was played in last year's Halloween event. And now we're going to move on and take a look at demons. This is Kumagoro's Heartless Summoning demon variant, and he played this a couple of times. I noticed that one version had Shred Memories to transmute for the Heartless Summonings, whereas this version did not. This version has Chalice of the Voids to take advantage of the fact that his mana curve is much higher. And as we talked about last week, Chalice of the Void is a card that can turn off quite easily a number of the most popularly played spells in Legacy Tribal Wars. He's got a Singleton Recurring Nightmare here, but it's not really about Recurring Nightmare, and we will look at Recurring Nightmare decks down the road during the wrap-up weeks, looking at the combo decks. Dismember, interesting. Dismember, of course, although you're only going to pay 1 mana for it a lot of the time, you can pay 2 or 3 at need, and of course it does not get shut down by a Chalice on 1 or 2, so it works around that quite nicely, as well as something like a Trinisphere. He's got Consume the Meek, which is a one-sided sweeper, considering that all his guys are huge. And Crucible of Worlds accounts for the use of some fetch lands here, even though he is in mono black, as well as possibly setting up a Crucible Wasteland lock. Additionally, he is using Ob Nixilis, which gives him something quite good to do by returning a fetch land every turn with Crucible of Worlds. Ob Nixilis can very quickly finish off a game just on his own, even though the poor guy doesn't have any evasion like all the rest of his demon buddies in this deck do. One of the things we talked about last week with the video on control is that you want some of your creatures to be able to do some of the heavy lifting that your spells would normally do in a traditional control deck. Now, demons are a great tribe for that, because you have guys like Bloodgift Demon, which basically gives you a Phyrexian Arena on a stick here, a nice 5-power flyer that can quickly finish the game and generate card advantage. He also has Pestilence Demon, Reaper from the Abyss, Carnifex Demon, all of these very good at sweeping the board or taking out troublesome creatures of your opponents. And the demons, again, excellent tribe for doing that. So instead of having to play sweepers separately, he's been able to make room for more support cards and simply build the board sweeping ability into his guys here. And of course, Pestilence Demon, because it can deal 1 damage to each creature or player, also gives you a way to just quickly finish off the game with damage to the face from a Cabal Coffers here. He's running Tabernacle of Pendrell Vale, which is something I've seen in a few of his lists. No real way to look for it here, but it is just a spicy little singleton against some of the Swarm decks. But I got to imagine that if he can get a Heartless Summoning down and start getting some of these guys out, he can have a pretty good game against those Swarm decks pretty quickly. But anyways, again, Chalice of the Void also doing some of that work. So an excellent, he wouldn't quite call this a control list exactly, but it has a lot of controlling elements in it. Again, black being the champ at things like creature kill, and having a lot of these sort of lose a life, gain, draw a card sort of abilities. A great way to have huge flying control finishers that can finish the game quickly, that also do something else for you. Now we're going to take a look at one deck which doesn't quite fit the mono black control mold, although it does have a lot of the same cards that you would expect to see there. This is from the pre-Blippi era, so it doesn't have a number to the event, but this was played in the classic Tribal Wars format in February 2010 by James McElhaney, and he came in first with this Rats deck, and it shows off one of the other things that black is very good at, which is discard. He actually has a lot packed into this deck, so let's take a look at it. He has Ravenous Rats, as well as Hymn to Turok as early discard, and of course I was sure to use the scarier looking art of the two available for Hymn to Turok, or for Ravenous Rats here. Crypt Rats, an excellent board sweeper, which you're probably familiar with from Mono Black Control, which can also again finish off the game because it will go to a player, but you have to spend only black mana that way. It is worth noting he's running Urborg here, although not Cabal Coffers, but he is running Urborg here to make sure that the swarm yards can tap for black at need. Chainer's Edict, which is still seen in some of the mono black lists that I see in Legacy Tribal Wars quite often, is a nice way to get a 2-for-1 late in the game. Chittering Rats, be careful when you're playing against Chittering Rats, because if you tend to be one of those guys that holds a land in your hand in the late game, and you're just digging for something, waiting for something to come, and he drops Chittering Rats and you have to put an island on the top of your deck, you're going to feel pretty stupid. So if you're playing against Rats, always remember that those guys could be coming down. It's probably more important to play around that than it is to try to bait out a Ravenous Rats by just holding the swamp. I mean, there's not really a big deal there. He's got also a Graveyard Exiling and Graveyard Stealing sub-theme worked into this deck with the Skull Snatchers, allowing him to exile cards from the opponent's graveyard, and then the Nezumi Graveyard doing the same thing, and then being able to flip and start stealing the opponent's guys. Ink Eyes, a very spicy addition to this deck, also does the same thing. In the late game, you can be able to ninjutsu him in for a surprise and bring something out from the opponent's graveyard, possibly something that you put there with one of the 4 Damnations that the deck is running. And Tendrils of Corruption, again talking about the Swamps Matter theme, very good creature control card which keeps you alive. This deck is not going to really go aggro, that's for sure. This deck is heavily relying on its Disruption as one of the sort of classically black abilities to keep it in the game long enough to be able to finish off the opponent. In this case, very likely finishing off the opponent with his own creatures taken back from Ink Eyes and from the Nezumi Graveyard. So that's the last deck of the day, and I appreciate you joining me. Next week we'll be back with a more normal episode. We're going to finish off with some of the random combo decks that have appeared in the event over the past couple of years, and thanks for joining me.